There we go. All right. So I'm really, really glad that we have a speaker with us today who is, remember what we're talking about is career conversations, but as different people had told me over the last few months, it really is important as we are talking about our careers and our professions to think about finances. And many people, I will say many women, typically, many professionals, many millennials, Gen Zers, don't really talk openly about money and about their financial health and well-being. And so while many of you are lawyers, law graduates, or law students, some of you are not. You might be in other professions or in other work. And I think it was really important. I was really glad to find Erica's book. Somebody had recommended it to me. And then having a couple of conversations with Erica over the last little while, she's got me thinking about a lot of things. And even though I'm sort of at the later stages of a career, there's still a lot of really good information that Erica is providing to us, including retirement planning. That's something that is on my mind, but things about your own psychological feelings about debt, that doesn't go away. And it really forced me to start thinking about things as we move forward. So as we move forward, for those of you who have joined the book club in the past, just a reminder that we are going to stay with others muted until we get to the questions and answers part later on in the session. We'll start with a bit of a background and history of Erica's career journey. Even as a non-lawyer, there's still a lot of experiences that she has that are so very relevant to all of us and so really important just to hear her journey. We'll then get into the book. There's a lot to get into in the book. And then, as you know, in the last little bit, we'll open it up to questions from all of you. So feel free to either put them in the chat or when it comes time to open it up and join us in the conversation. If you want to tweet or do something on LinkedIn or on anywhere else, hashtag GA Career Conversations would be what I would ask you to use. And I think before we begin, we're just a reminder to everybody about the accountable space suggestions that I had sent out earlier, thanks to Elise Ahencora, and the reminder that we're all here to share and learn from one another, but also create that space where you're accountable for our own actions, our own curiosity, and our own questions and comments that we put forward. So without further ado, and I'll monitor the people who are coming in, Erica, as well, but over to you first. We always like starting off with an understanding from our author as to what their own career journey was. You had worked with a number of different organizations, as we saw from your bio. You've been with Canadian Business Magazine, Maclean's, Global News, Wall Street Journal, Globe and Mail. Can you share with us briefly some of your personal highlights? And when we talked, there was so many different things that you had done. Your own career journey, how and why did you start each of the roles, and how and when did you move on from those different roles? So over to you.
So thank you very much, Gina, for having me. I'm very excited about this evening and being able to talk careers and personal finance, and being able to talk to a bunch of lawyers or lawyers in the making. So my own career path. So I always wanted to be a journalist. That never changed ever since elementary school. But it was a pretty interesting journey. So first of all, I am not a native Canadian, as probably a good number of you. So I was born and grew up in Italy and didn't move to North America until university. So I actually did an exchange, a year as an exchange student in the States in high school. And then went back, I did undergrad in Italy, and did not really move to North America until my early 20s, when I went to grad school. And that was in the US. So Canada was not really on the radar for me until later on. I'd been an exchange student in the US, so really the US was on my mind. And I went to grad school at Georgetown University in DC. And I studied political science and international relations, not journalism, even though that was the goal. And so one of the things, so Gina was sort of talking to me about like being very strategic and planning, and I'm definitely a planner when it comes to my career. I'm always like thinking about where I want to go and how to get there. But there's also been a lot of revising of my plans, not just because of circumstances, but also because of things that I learned about myself. And so the first big sort of discovery, self-discovery for me was that I'm actually not cut out to be a foreign correspondent. So I initially went, I studied international relations, which I love studying it. And the plan was I just wanted to travel. I wanted to, travel from all over the world and just report the news from there. And so right after I graduated from Georgetown, I went to Iran, where I knew I could go with an Italian passport, being much easier for me to go to Iran than if I'd had a US or Canadian passport for that matter. And I went there and I had a lovely experience, mostly trying to better my Farsi. I had taken some Farsi in school. I could like ask for instruction. I could survive. I did survive. But it was wonderful. I stayed with an Iranian family there. It was a unique experience that I will treasure forever. But it also taught me that that was not the life for me. And I'm very glad I did it. And I'm very glad I had that realization early on in my career. I very much wanted to be a journalist, but not that kind of journalist. I was much more kind of a bourgeois. I really liked living in a big city, and I realized I really liked routine, and it was too much adrenaline and not enough structure to be a foreign correspondent. So then I sort of went into reporting on the economy. And the link there, so there's a reason why, because I am a political science like nerd, and I really like, it's not so much politics that I like, it's policy and public policy. And so I was like, okay, so I didn't like at all covering foreign policy from, at this point, it was Canada, because I'd met my husband, who's my now husband, who's Canadian. So we had moved to Toronto, and I started working at Maclean's, initially as an intern, and then as an associate editor. And I was like, well, what do I want to cover? How can I really want to talk about public policy, and economics was it. Not a lot of people were able to cover economics. I had taken enough economics in undergrad and grad school that I could definitely get by. I knew the basics. It gave me a bit of an edge, because not a lot of people who go into journalism know anything about economics. And I found it really interesting, because it really was like I was writing and editing, and it was mostly about public policy and economic policy. And so I found that really, really interesting. And I started, I sort of revamped. Maclean's at that point had a blog about the economy. And I called it EconWatch, and I really revamped it. And eventually we attracted a lot of the country's top economists that started writing for Maclean's. And at 26, I was their editor, which was fun.
Overwhelming and gratifying at the same time, right?
Yeah. And then life happened, as it does. And so my husband at the time was trying to be an academic in the US, and so we were long distance for a long period of time, and then we got tired of being long distance, and so I maneuvered so that Maclean's, and at that point also Canadian Business, which were both owned by Rogers, and so it was like kind of sister publications almost. So I got them to sponsor me for a journalist visa, so that I can move to the US with my husband and sort of work remotely and kind of continue to do my job but also sort of move around. And so I kind of like followed my husband around because I'm trying to, work out two careers, right? Like when you have two people in a couple who are very career driven, that's also the compromises and the challenges of that. I think it's something that people face very often. So we did that. I was in California, and then I was in Boston, and then at one point I was getting really tired of working on my own. I really do love the newsroom. So I moved to a newspaper. It's called the Christian Science Monitor, which is not very well known in Canada, but it is quite well known in the US. And despite the name, really has nothing to do with Scientology. Is something that and I am not a Christian Scientist, but I knew the paper because they have a great coverage of foreign affairs. And that they're, very, it's what everyone reads in the US State Department. And so I knew from having attended Georgetown, like I knew the publication very well. And so I became an international business editor for them. And I did that for a bit. And then we decided that we wanted to have a family and raise that family in Canada. So my husband and I moved back to Toronto. And that was kind of like restarting my career all over again. So I should say that I interned at the Wall Street Journal right after Georgetown, and then couldn't stay in the US for visa reasons. So went to Iran, and then went to Canada and started in Canada, and then did the whole thing of, moving around the US, and then went back to Canada, and it felt like starting again for the third time. But, I worked my contacts that I still had from having worked in Canada, for a couple of years. Went to a lot of coffee chats, and eventually it led to a good tip about a good job that was opening up at Global News. And I got the job, and then I became sort of the money and consumer reporter at Global News, where they sort of had carte blanche to define what money coverage was meant to be. And so I did a whole bunch of writing. That's when I sort of started focusing on personal finance, because after many years of covering the economy, I felt like what I liked the most was sort of telling the story of how big macroeconomic trends and public policy failures and whatnot affected people's lives and their individual decision making. And I felt like I wanted to really focus on that and kind of like cover it from the other end. And so start from the individual and then look at the bigger trends shaping their decisions. And so that's why I switched to sort of personal finance. I started a newsletter that became very popular called Money 123. And eventually that newsletter became a TV segment that I anchored, even though I had zero experience in broadcast, and I am not a native speaker, which you can absolutely tell when I'm nervous and I'm in front of a camera. So that aired for a couple of years inside Global National on Saturday evening. And then, I covered the craziness of the pandemic, and I wrote the book, Money Like You Mean It, and then eventually I moved to the Globe and Mail, where I am now, and I am one of their personal finance reporters.
Erica, I just love, there's so many aspects of the career journey that you have, and coming to an understanding at some point. I'm quoting you, too much adrenaline and not enough structure. That was sort of one of the aha moments. And I think when we talk about career and the strategy behind career, thinking about what's important to you and what you value or what doesn't feel right is very important. So I think that for me, when you made that comment, that you thought, okay, I've got to pivot, because there's one thing to be a foreign correspondent, the reality of it, And then another thing, to know what you want, that structure, that stability, was something that you were craving at that point in time, once you got a bit of a foot into the door. And then I really am grateful that you use the word coffee chats. Like, we've talked about networking with this group at different times, but being able to work your network to figure out different opportunities that are possible as you move forward. And I will say, I know there's a few people for whom English might not be their first language. And when you and I first met, I had no idea. But taking what you see as a bit of a challenge and just working through it. So you've sort of answered the one question about serendipity and strategic planning, because it's been a bit of both in your career. So we have much to talk about with this book. So let's dive into it with the very first question, which is why. You said you did it during COVID. What's your why for the book? Why was this an important book for you in particular to research and to share with others?
So I really felt, and a bit because I'm kind of like, I am coming from sort of like that policy background, and I was an economics reporter before I became a personal finance reporter. I really felt that right now, I would say more so than in the past, and for everybody, but more so for the younger generations, so millennials and Gen Z. um so much of personal finance is really shaped by a lot of things and trends that are outside of the individual's control. And I'm thinking about housing first and foremost, right? It's so expensive. And when I started writing the book in at the very beginning of the pandemic, we used to think that unaffordable housing was mostly a Toronto and Vancouver problem, right? It was starting to become a Montreal and Ottawa, problem. And then during the pandemic, it became like an everybody problem, like everywhere. Like it's now the challenge is finding a place where housing is still affordable, right? And there's that. There's of course, investing. This has been a trend for a long time. That there's for most people, unless you're going into the civil service, there's not going to be an employer who's going to take care of your pension. You have to figure it out, and you're going to have to figure it out quickly. And start investing early, which is super important. There's also the question of debt, right? Like Canadians owe collectively more than 2 trillion in debt. Like what we owe as a country, like is pretty much equivalent to the value of our GDP, like what we produce in a year,
That was
which
a
is really
frightening stat.
mind-boggling.
That was a frightening stat when I read that.
And why is that? There's a tendency in personal finance to really always boil everything down to individual decisions. And I don't want to minimize that. Like, of course, like individual decisions are important. Personal agency is important. You can make good or bad choices. But let's face it, like there is tremendous pressure on people to take on debt. And more than anybody, young people, tuition, has been kind of stagnating hasn't grown that fast for the past few years, but for a long time, it grew much faster than inflation, right? And then you have housing, which, is just like, off the charts expensive. Those are two major reasons why young people end up with enormous amounts of debt that are very difficult to manage early on in their career, when you're sort of your income is the lowest is going to be, right? Over the course of your career. And those are not really discretionary spending that you can do without, right? And then and this holds for every generation. There's technological advancement, which has has many positive impacts. Like it's become very easy to invest. If you've learned, if you've educated yourself, it's actually very accessible and very, very easy to invest your money well. But technological innovation has also made it that much easier to borrow. So we've loaded up on debt because interest rates have been, before the pandemic, have been low for over a decade, very, very low, record lows historically. So debt was very, very cheap. So it's very easy to load up on debt. And we loaded up on debt because, the credit card use has, exploded. You can now pay with your phone, you can get a loan on the internet, you have, the second coming of buy now, pay later, which now you can buy a pair of shoes in installments. Like all these things just make it that much easier to fall into certain financial traps. And it requires a higher level of planning, strategy, and financial awareness to be able to navigate the world we live in today.
It's funny as you're saying this. I know that in Ontario, if I'm not mistaken, anybody who has little kids can correct me. They're finally thinking about introducing a financial management or financial planning course, a conversation about finances, because the sooner we introduce it and talk about it, the better I think all of us would be, because it's such a taboo topic. And Anne, I really appreciate the comment that you made in terms of professional decisions motivated by money. We'll come to that a little bit later on in terms of what comes first, or is it a chicken and or an egg situation. Erica, so your why was really, as you said earlier, there's so much going on. You had seen the macro component of it, and you wanted to really bring down the help individuals, tell the stories about individuals and how the macro is really impacted by how each individual is impacted by the macro. Let's start with some specifics though. Living costs, because you talked about that throughout your book. They are through the roof. They, we'll be seeing some change. And I think what we talk about today won't be impacted significantly differently over the next few years. I think it's still critical information. What's your advice about making sure that we continue to live, and I love the phrase, within our means, even in these inflationary times? Do you have some suggestions for the group?
Yeah, so I think so with so much pressure kind of like pushing you in the wrong direction, my motto is do things, work smarter, not harder, right? And when it comes to staying on track financially, that means understanding sort of how the human brain works, so that you can make it easier for yourself to make good financial decisions. And so that starts with, setting some goals, right? So know what you are saving for, what you're setting money aside for. It's very difficult to save if you're not clear on what your priorities are. That said, knowing what your priorities are is like by no means enough. So if you have, say, a big goal, like maybe you have a lot of debt, a lot of student debt, a lot of credit card debt, or maybe you have a big goal like saving for a down payment, right? Those are like big, overwhelming goals, right? It will take you a long time to reach them. So to keep yourself on track, it's much easier psychologically if you set yourself intermediate goals. If you have that target in sight and it feels achievable, it's much easier to keep track of your progress and feel like you're accomplishing something and feel like you can accomplish something, right? And so I'm a big fan of just like any goal you have, split it into monthly goals. So every month you have a target, right? And then, you can also use some like visual aids. For example, there's like a New York blogger who's his blog is called Big Law. And, he was struggling with this like enormous debt that he wanted to repay quickly from becoming a lawyer in the US. And so he made a paper chain that he hung all through his apartment. And every loop of the chain was a certain amount of money. And so every time he paid off that amount of money, he would shred a loop. And it was really motivating for him to see that, paper chain getting smaller and smaller. So that's a psychological trick, a psychological hack sort of that can keep you motivated. And then, psychology is very important, but you also need method. So you really need a way to budget, which is a word that a lot of people really dislike. It doesn't have to be an old-fashioned budget. Let me say this up front. So some people really thrive on the discipline of, Excel charts and really sort of keeping track of everything they spend. My dad is one person who really likes doing that. And if that works for you, fantastic. But personal finance is personal, and really budgets do not work for everybody. A lot of people, and I don't know this from like directly, but I have spoken to so many financial planners who tell me that a lot of people they really get tripped up by a budget, either because they're very labor intensive and they just don't have the time to, note everything. Another common trap is people start budgeting with a million categories, and then life doesn't quite unfold the way the budget, like it doesn't fit in the budget. So they start like borrowing from one category because they overspend in another category, and then lo and behold, they just get frustrated, and and that's the end of the budget. So budget don't really work for me either. So I should mention, there are also a number of good budgeting apps that sort of allow you kind of to budget the old-fashioned way without using Excel sheets and such. They kind of like, you need to allow them to track your financial transactions. So some people are not comfortable with that. But if you are, something like You Need a Budget, or there's another one, Mint, sort of by the company behind sort of Intuit, behind TurboTax. Those two are very popular, and I've heard certainly very good things about them. But if you want to steer clear of budgets, you can. And so what I do, and a lot of other people, this is not something that I invented, but it doesn't really have a name, so I call it the money bucket system. And this consists of sort of setting up more than your typical sort of checking account, savings account, and sort of retirement accounts. You set up a few more accounts, and then the idea is to assign different bank accounts to things that people generally struggle with. So it's surprises, like unexpected expenses. So maybe you'll have a savings account that's for an emergency fund. I like to actually have two, one for small surprise expenses, and a separate bigger one for the mother of all emergencies, which is unemployment. And then you assign, say, another account for irregular expenses, which you should be able to, they're not really surprises, right? But they throw people off track because they don't happen every month. And so that could be seasonal spending, like, if you have kids, summer camps, or it can be Christmas spending, or maybe, in the spring, I feel like we do a lot more house repairs, and we have a lot more, our household sort of maintenance expenses spike. And so once you have sort of a sense of how your spending changes through the year, you're going to notice that there are some spikes and some things that really show up maybe once, maybe twice a year. And having a separate account is about thinking ahead, forcing yourself to think ahead and saying, okay, so last year we spent, I don't know, $3,000 on summer camps, for example, which is shocking, but definitely pretty common. So now it's, say, September, I'm going to need the money by March. Divide that by how many months you have, and I'm going to set aside, a certain amount of money every month into that savings account. You can also have sort of a separate account for bills and routine expenses, so that when your paycheck lands in your sort of default checking account, you know how much you need to transfer to pay all your bills. And then you need to know how much you need to transfer to pay sort of for regular expenses or to rebuild your emergency savings, how much you need to channel to your retirement accounts. And then whatever is left there is money that you can spend without worry and without tracking cents.
I love the fact, Erica, that you start off by saying personal finances are personal, and what works for one person may not work for the other. And I think people around the computer screen probably are. Some might be saying, "I love budgets." My husband's a banker, so we had budgets, and I hated them at first, but I have to say, after a little while, it was a tool, and I needed a tool, and it was a really useful tool for me to use. But it is a personal choice, and you've given us a way that might be working for others. I think what I take away from this in particular is that you have to be intentional about it. For many, I wonder if anybody on the call or who's watching it later on would say, I just want to, hope for the best, roll the dice and hope for the best, and just sort of not have to think about it. What you're advocating is to be intentional, to be thoughtful about it, and to plan it. We talk about careers, but planning your budget, or your financial well-being, taking a look once or twice a year. And on that point, I wonder if you can you talk a lot in your book about knowing your debt. What does that mean? And whether it's for students or for professionals or for lawyers who've been out for a while, what do you mean by knowing your debt, and how's that important for us to think about it, just like everything else that you're asking us to think about?
Yeah, so some strains of personal finance have this attitude of like, oh, debt is bad, right? There's like some people advocate they should avoid all debt if you can, right? Like, so first of all, I find like that's not realistic for most people. Like, you have to be quite privileged to sail through life without having to take on any debt. And frankly, debt can be useful. So I really feel like it's not a matter of debt bad, but like some kinds of debt bad and some kinds of debt bad in certain situations. And that can really vary. So one thing, I'll sort of give you an example. So lines of credit, I find, are really a kind of debt that you really want to learn about. So as a law student, so you probably, a lot of people nowadays will have to rely on a student line of credit to finance their studies. Because government student loans just aren't going to cover it, right? They're just not enough, especially if you've already had to borrow for your undergrad. And so lines of credit can be very useful, but the really tricky. There are a couple of things that are really tricky about lines of credit. The first one is the fact that I have a variable interest rate. As probably a lot of you know, now that interest rates have gone up that much, that's really something. Like, you have to know what your rate is and what interest rate changes will mean. It's in I've talked to some law students or some medical students who felt like it was so stressful they didn't even know what their interest rate was. But I was like, you really have to track it because you have to plan ahead, and you have to have a plan for how you're going to tackle that debt once it becomes time to repay once you're done with your studies. The other thing is flexibility. So flexibility is a double-edged sword with a lot of financial instruments and lines of credit included. So it's very handy because lines of credit work pretty much like a credit card, right? So you have a certain amount that you can borrow, and then you sort of borrow as you need, and then you repay and you free up room to borrow. So it's a revolving credit. Just like credit cards. And that can be really useful, especially if you're using lines of credit to help pay for some of your living expenses, right? Like, you have those variable spending, and that's nice. The flexibility comes in very handy. But flexibility and also, flexibility, the fact that there's not a certain payment that you have to make. There's a minimum payment, but there's not like a fixed timeline for paying off a line of credit. That can become a slippery slope, right? Like you can stick to the minimum payment and really take forever to repay the line of credit. And the flexibility also means that you can borrow more than you absolutely need to, especially if you're using a line of credit for, again, living expenses. And so that's where end lines of credit also become very tricky when you're a homeowner. And so home equity lines of credit that are backed by the equity in your home can be even trickier. There you can make minimum payments that only cover the interest on your debt. And that's where a lot of people fall into like a debt trap that they really struggle to get out of. You can borrow hundreds of thousands of dollars with a home equity line of credit, and you can kick the can down the road for a very long time by making just interest-only payments. And if you hit a financial rough patch, it can be very handy to have that very small payment. But it also requires a lot of discipline to repay a big debt on a home equity line of credit. And so that's not to say, like, home equity lines of credit, for example, like student lines of credit, the flexibility is handy. When is it handy? It's super useful to have a home equity line of credit to pay for home repairs. Like, no matter how new your home is, no matter what kind of home inspection you got when you bought a home, houses are full of surprises. And so you might get that, $15,000 house repair that has to be done right away. And that's when a home equity line of credit comes in really handy. You have that money there and you don't necessarily have to raid your emergency fund to pay for that repair. Or, when you're doing a home renovation, home renovations go over budget all the time. So a loan doesn't really cut it because, if you pay just as much as, you estimated the reno will cost, you could go over budget and be in a bind, or maybe, or then you'd have to pay, maybe, have to pay more than you actually need. So a line of credit is really nice for that flexibility. But I almost feel like once you've had the expense and, the big expense of the renovation, it almost makes sense to take out a loan and convert the line of credit into a loan so that if you struggle to be disciplined, so that you have that sort of those deadlines that you have to meet on that loan.
In your book, you talked frequently about how easy it is to get debt. And as you said, you correctly say, don't look at it as an absolute no, but that discipline that you're just referencing, Erica, is something we have to be mindful. It's so easy. I know that in law school, for example, banks are looking for people to come in and, you're going to be a future professional, so let's give you a line of credit. And it becomes a challenge for some to be able to be mindful of that. I want to move to the next part because you're talking about a home equity line of credit, and around the table, we may have some people who are renting, some people who are buying. And I really respected and was grateful in your book where you commented on, people think that adulting, getting to a sign of adulthood means buying that property. And you really had a balanced approach to it. But let's talk about home ownership and sort of whether or not, about housing, not home ownership, but about housing. You call it the biggest financial challenge, and how can people tackle that challenge? Let's hear your take on housing. I should use the word housing, not home ownership.
Yeah, and really things have become so much tougher. Like, I already thought they were tough when I started writing the book. They're so much tougher now. And so we had this like crazy housing boom during the pandemic. Then home prices went down only a little bit, and interest rates shot up. And so it's that much more, maybe how the price of a house is a little bit cheaper, but the cost of getting a mortgage, borrowing through a mortgage, is that much higher. And it really has eroded any affordability gains from home prices coming down a little bit. And then we have rents that went completely through the roof, not just in Toronto, but pretty much all over Southern Ontario and in a lot of other parts of Canada. renting itself has become very difficult to afford. So there is no magic here that I have to share. It is like I said, it is far and by far the biggest financial challenge I feel that someone at the beginning of their career is facing. How do I reconcile the cost of keeping a roof over my head with the cost of the rest of my life, right? However, what you want to do is like tackle this question with open eyes, like really be rational, don't be emotional, and you may have to face some tough decisions, but it is much better to face those decisions than to bury your head in the sand, because those decisions you will have to make them eventually, and you don't want to have to make them when you're broke, right? So what am I talking about? So, first of all, sort of I tackled the question of home ownership versus renting, right? So from sort of strictly sort of a personal finance point of view, so there are a lot of misconceptions culturally in Canada about home ownership. And so one of them is like, this idea of like everybody has to own a house, right? Or, like renting is paying your landlord's mortgage and you're not building equity. And yes, of course, if people bought a house, in the 90s or even the early 2000s, or frankly, like me, even 2015, I've already dodged two massive housing booms. Like, great, you have an asset that has really appreciated, and that's fantastic and good for you and lucky you. But you have to approach it from, like at the end of the day, you have to have housing that you can afford, right? Like that's the priority, not trying to get your hands on an asset if you can't afford to acquire that asset, right? Because you have to live in the asset. So it's not really that much that you can do unless you can invest in housing as an investment, right? But if you're looking for a house to live in, just focus on what you can afford. And so from a financial point of view, you can be a wealthy renter. There's an excellent book about that called The Wealthy Renter, which makes the mathematical argument for renting. And the mathematical argument is, if you rent and you can afford to save, and if you're a renter in this market who can save at this point, you're probably able to save much more as a renter than you would be sort of buying an equivalent house, right? Because renting is still cheaper compared to owning. And a lot of people compare sort of the cost of a mortgage to the rent. That's a false equivalency. You have property taxes, you have, home insurance, which can be much more expensive than renter's insurance. You're going to have all kinds of repairs that come up all the time. There's all kinds of costs involved in home ownership that do not go into that, much more than the mortgage, first of all. And also there's a lot of money that homeowners throw down the drain that do not build equity. So if you're a renter who can save and who can invest, and that requires knowing how to invest, but you can just, save, you can grow your money in the stock market and you're going to be completely fine. So let go of the anxiety of, oh my goodness, I need to buy a house to build wealth. There are other ways to build wealth. The question with renting is, at this point, a different mathematical question, not so much the question of not building equity, not building wealth. The question is, can you save as a renter? So it's not enough to compare. And in the book, I sort of walk people through an easy way of comparing the cost of home ownership to the cost of renting, apples to apples. But comparing the cost of home ownership to the cost of renting is not enough. You also have to compare the cost of renting to your income. And, like if there's not much left at the end of the month, then that's a really tight spot to be in, because as a homeowner, like worst case scenarios, homeowners, like home equity is something you can tap into. Definitely not ideal, not something you want to plan on, but there is sort of you have an asset that you can sell, you did it's a financial safety net to own a house. And so as a renter, you absolutely want to be able to save and save quite a bit. And so the question is, if your income isn't high enough with these crazy rents that we have, then what do you do, right? The other question before I move on to sort of what do you do is a question of lifestyle. And so renting doesn't have to mean instability. And I say this as a European, like in other countries in Europe, like I lived in Germany. Germany is starting to have some issues in some cities that are similar to Canada's, but for a long time, renting was stability. Like people would just rent the same place for decades, and it was just a different system, and it was fine. But the way renting and housing policy works and has worked for years in Canada means that renters in Canada very often do not have stability. And so there's the risk of your rent going up unless you live in a rent controlled unit. There's landlords, not that all landlords are bad by any means, but they certainly can and do exploit a number of loopholes. There's renovictions, there's all kinds of things, right? And so there's that kind of having to move around, which become burdensome, especially if you want to have a family, and moving with small kids is no fun. There's the question of once you become a little, we built a billion, a huge number of bachelor and 1 bedroom and 2 bedroom apartments, right? We do not have a lot of rentals that are 3+ bedrooms, right? So there's all kinds of lifestyle considerations tied to renting in Canada that also have to factor in your decision. So whether you're renting or buying, the question is, can you afford housing where you are now with the job that you want to do, right? That starts to become a question that a lot of people start to face, where it really boils down to, maybe I have to do a different job. So for lawyers, it can be, maybe I need to be a corporate lawyer to make ends meet, to live in the big city. Or if I really want to be in sort of an area of law that is less lucrative, then I have to live somewhere else. Is that okay? Like, unfortunately, like these are hard compromises. I am not downplaying at all how difficult these decisions are. Like, where do I want to live and what do I want to do for a living? Those two things are often at odds. But if that's the question that you're facing, tackling it head on is much better than burying your head in the sand and then finding yourself, at like in your late 30s, early 40s, where you haven't saved anything. You have to move out of the big city, or you have to switch career anyways. And now you haven't been saving for a decade.
Erica, it's funny because I look at sort of Anne's comment, Vasilki's comments about career choices. And as you said, you do have to make some choices, whether it's where to live, and you can balance it, right? I want to do X, but that means I might not be able to live in Y area, and I might have to move. And making those choices really is something that we need to think about, rather than burying our head in the sand, as you said. And I see it all the time with young professionals, with older professionals. It comes up again. There are a couple of people on the call, for example, where it comes up again in terms of the decision to move into the partnership, and then loans that typically have to come for that. Well, what have you been, how have your finances been up until that point? And what about that commitment? So it starts very early on from the choices we make, and hopefully there can be a balance between our career choices and our financial choices, but we need to be able to think them through together. They're really intertwined. In the interest of time, I'm going to So the part that always scares me, I'll be completely honest, is when we talk about investing. And when I had to read that chapter a couple of times, and there's still areas of it, Erica, that I've got to go back to again. But when we talk about young professionals and investing, where do you begin if you've never done it, or even if you have done it a little bit and you're trying to understand it better? You talked about cryptocurrency, and I just went, oh my God, those are phrases that I should know more about. And I was glad to at least have the foundations. But tell us, where to begin as we start off in careers?
So the first thing is to learn about investing. Right? So what I hear often from sort of like young lawyers, young doctors, people who have the potential to become, have high incomes and high net worth, is that they didn't learn any of it in school, right? They didn't go to business school or anything like that. And so I think the instinct is, I'll just hand it all over to a financial advisor. And that's fine if you want to do it, but you can't relinquish control. Like, you have to know, you have to educate yourself, you have to know the basics. First of all, because you may very well be able to do it yourself, especially at the beginning. Financial planning gets really tricky. Like, the trickiest part of financial planning is towards retirement. You can often, start on your own if you sort of self-educate, and you can definitely manage your own investments if you sort of learn the basics of investing. And even if you want to hand everything to a financial advisor, you have to know the basics of investing to be able to gauge who is sitting in front of you, and are they really bringing value, and the fees that you're paying, are they worth it, right? What are they doing? Are they a good financial advisor? Are they not? And learning the basics of investing, it's really it really doesn't involve, it's really not about math. It's about a few simple concepts. Like, I'm terrible at math. There's a reason why I'm in journalism. Right? It's really about sort of understanding some basic concepts that I go over in the book. And it's really it's understanding, first and foremost, sort of the concept. And I'm talking specifically, there's various ways to invest, right? Like, what I'm talking about here is investing in the financial market, which is like just a very, very accessible way of growing your money. And so the basic thing really that you need to understand is, how do I manage my risk in the financial market? What does it mean, right? Because investing in the financial market, like, a lot of people think it's like playing roulette or gambling, and it's really not, right? Like, it's you are taking on a risk. Yes, the stock market goes up and down, but the idea is, like, there are many ways to manage your risk. And so you just have to understand sort of the basic concepts behind that. And so things like diversification, right? So if you're investing for retirement and investing money that you can't afford to lose, it's not a gamble of like, let's see if I can make a quick buck. And no, you're like, I need this money to grow, and I have a long period of time to let it grow. So you want to have a diversified portfolio, which means you want to spread your risk, across. So when you're investing, so first of all, just a quick sort of backup, as investing in the stock market, buying stocks means you're buying tiny shares of companies, right? That means that you then get to share in their success. So if the company does well, the value of your stock will go up, or the company will sometimes also sort of distribute a little bit of their profits back to you as a shareholder as a dividend. And if you invest in bonds, you become a lender. So you're lending money. You can be lending money to companies. You can be lending money to municipalities or other forms of government. And bonds are sort of less considered generally as a type of investment, less risky than companies, because, generally people, entities pay their money back. They really have to go belly up to not repay their debts. But if you're, if you're betting on a company, you're really sharing their success, and a lot of companies are not that successful. So that's the basic concept. But you want to spread your risk, right? Like, you don't want to bet on just one company. It doesn't matter what it is. If it's, you get questions all the time about putting all your money in Amazon, right? And you have to ask, you have to think, like, anything can happen to Amazon. What if, doesn't matter how successful a company has been, right? That's a tremendous amount of risk to just put your eggs in a single basket. You want to put spread your eggs across industries, different sectors. Think about what happened in the pandemic, where airlines and hotel shares plummeted like drastically. So that's why you really want to spread across the economy. Not a bad idea to spread geographically too. So don't, especially Canadians, do not put all yours, or I shouldn't say that, but like, it's, you have to think about, do I really want to have all my holdings in Canada, which is not a very diversified economy. We have a lot of banks, we have a lot of mining companies and oil companies, energy. The energy sector and financial sector are huge, not super diversified though, right? So investing across countries, not a bad idea either. And then another way of managing risk is if you have, a longer time horizon for growing your money, you can afford to take on more risk. And why is that? Because the stock market, if you've ever seen sort of that jagged line, goes up and down every day, every minute almost, depending on investor sentiment and all of that. But over long periods of time, that jagged line tends to trend up, right? So if we're talking decades, right, then you can afford to move up and down quite a bit in the long term if you keep your money invested. And that's another thing, sort of, as you approach the time when you're going to have to take some money out, so usually as you approach retirement, you're going to want to slow down that volatility, right? Because then you really matters where you end up when finally you have to take off the money out. And so investing in bonds, especially sort of in bonds, used to sort of, when interest rates were high, used to also be sort of a nice way to get a sort of a nice return through the interest rate that you're you lend money and earn a nice return when interest rates were higher. For a long time, interest rates have been so low that the kind of like one of the main reasons to hold bonds is that they don't go up and down, like the prices, quite as much. And so having a mix of stocks and bonds was a way to kind of like slow down that line going, it was like maybe a little more gentle. Now with interest rates up again, there's a bit of a revival of bonds, and people are rethinking a little bit the role of bonds in their portfolio. But the other thing to think about when you're thinking about risk is how much risk can you tolerate, and that's really it's personal. It depends. Again, it depends on just like your risk tolerance and your personality, and maybe it depends on where you're at in your life. Again, are you like just starting to invest and have 30-40 years ahead of you, or are you starting to approach retirement, and then your risk tolerance should be a little lower, and you want to choose investments that you're going to be able to stick with, and so it's the sort of the gut check. So if seeing that line going up and down and checking your investments and seeing like they've dropped, like makes you lose sleep and eventually, right, like that's the thing, like people panic and sell once you set up a nice diversified portfolio that fits your circumstances and your needs, you need to stick with it. And you need to pick something that you can stick with, and that generally has to do with how the share of bonds that you have in your portfolio. Because the worst thing is to sell when everyone else is panicking and selling, right? That's how you crystallize your losses. And no matter how well you've crafted your portfolio, you will go through recessions, you will go through dips. There's going to be scary moments, right? So you just want to choose something that you can stick with. And I'll tell you my journey, because your risk tolerance can also change just by being in the stock market, in the market, right? Like once you've gone through a couple of those dips and you've seen the value of your portfolio recover, it becomes less scary. And it doesn't matter how much you've read, and how you also have to know it emotionally that your money will recover, right? There's a big difference between reading about these theoretical concepts and then seeing your hard-earned savings drop, right?
Erica, I can attest to that, because I can remember early on when we'd get that first statement in, and I'd see $100 less a year or $1,000 less a year, and I thought, oh my God! But in a wide, and as you said, both our own risk tolerance and our time horizon are really important, and sort of having to be able to say, okay, it's going to be okay in the long run, hopefully, with certain choices, as long as we review it on a regular basis. Your comments also in the book, and I want to go to one last question before we open up to the group, but your comments in the book, just the reminder to use the tools, and I hope this is in the right context, to use the tools that the government offers, whether it's RSPs or whether it's oh my God, TFSAs, to use them as you can, as much as you can, to get that benefit. Before we open it up to the questions from the group, and there are a couple of areas that I'm bypassing, but I wanted to have you talk about what you call the BOMAD, Bank of Mom and Dad. Some people may not have it, but I really appreciated your frank conversation about this. And I also appreciated your perspective, because you've said throughout, whether it's talking about housing, whether it's talking about job security or debt, whether it's talking about investing, a lot of it is personal. A lot of it is also cultural. A lot of it is based on sort of our experiences. So I'm going to turn over to you about BOMAD, Bank of Mom and Dad, pros, cons, if you don't have. What's your take on that? And then as we're saying that, folks, be ready to ask any questions that you might have once Erica finishes this question.
Yeah, so I have to say, cultural attitudes in Canada, I feel, have changed tremendously just in the past few years. Like since I feel like the pandemic housing boom has really brought that realization to older parents that, oh my goodness, I have to step in and help. And when I wrote the book, there was like a real stigma still attached to providing and accepting help, providing help for adult kids, and then, for adults to get help from their parents. And I have to say, just in the past year and a half, I've had so many conversations with Canadians across the country where both the older parents and the young adults were like, no, this is it. That's the way it has to be. There's no other way. So I feel like the stigma is really going away quite quickly all of a sudden, which is great, I find, because the stigma, because when sort of that kind of help of mom and dad swooping in to help you, buy a house, it used to be, again, more of a Vancouver and Toronto phenomenon. And there was tremendous stigma attached to it. And when there's stigma attached to something, then people tend to do the thing and not talk about it and pretend like it's not happening, which when you're talking about lending money, borrowing money, can lead to a lot of misunderstandings and major family drama. So transparency always the way to go. So I'm really glad that the stigma is sort of kind of falling away. Nonetheless, so there are some practical considerations. So if if you're in the lucky position in which your parents can help you financially, it's still like very good idea. You just need to have an open conversation, even if there's no stigma, even if they're happy to help you, right? So first of all, you want to sort of ask them whether they, make sure that they can really afford it. And that's not too sort of, you don't want to pry in their private financial affairs, but one of the things, for example, is like, you want to maybe sort of ask them the question, like, maybe you should talk to a financial planner just to make sure that you can afford to give me this money and still retire when you're planning to retire. Or like, have you thought about, for example, the cost of long-term care? Right? That's a part of retirement that's unpleasant to think about, and a lot of people completely forget to account for. So you don't want to do the financial check-in for them, but you want to ask them if they've done that financial check-in themselves, and maybe I say, maybe you should do it before we decide whether you can give money or how much you can give. The other thing is, you want to be clear about, are there strings attached with this money? So like often there are, like, let's not lie, like emotional strings, all kinds of strings, especially when it's family. But sometimes it sort of goes beyond that. Like, I will pay for your education if you go into a certain field of study, or I will buy you a house or help you with a down payment only if it's in a certain area or the house that I think you should be living in, right? And maybe you're okay with that compromise, and maybe you're not, but best to talk about these kinds of strings up front, and then you can decide whether to take it or leave it. If and then there's sort of more technical things of what is the best way. Like, once you've assessed, okay, fine, I can get this financial help, and I can and everything's going to be fine, and this is how much it's going to be, and then there's a question of what is the best way to give the money. And then there are kind of like that's when it really pays to maybe talk to an estate lawyer, or a financial planner or real estate lawyer. There's all kinds of things that parents can do, even if they have no money to give. They can be guarantee your mortgage, and it's good to talk about the risks involved for them too. If they gift you money, and that money then goes to you or your spouse, what are the implications if you split up? If it's a loan, then there are other implications. There are implications even like if your parents lend you money for a down payment, it limits your ability to qualify. It can limit your ability to qualify for a mortgage. So there's all kinds of technicalities that should be explored with a professional. And then there's also ethical questions of, should I accept this money? Because of course, let's be honest, this kind of help perpetuates and income inequality, wealth inequality. And nowadays we live in a society where if your family, if your parents are homeowners and they've seen tremendous equity gains through the decades, because the house that they bought like in the 80s or in the 90s has it's many times worth it's worth many times what they paid for, then they might have the financial firepower to help you buy a house. And someone who comes, who doesn't have that advantage, you won't be able to buy a house. And that makes a tremendous difference, right? So there's that question, and I talk about that question, and my take is, if you have that helping hand ready, that's there for you, and you've assessed that your parents are going to be fine and they can help you and they're going to be fine, I say take it, take advantage of it. But the only thing I would say, it's really not the reasons why we're in this situation, like the inequality, the housing market, is so much bigger than you, that you not taking that helping hand is not really going to make that much of a difference, other than to yourself. But I would say, be very honest about the help that you have received, because really the worst, and what I find ethically troubling, is people who conceal the fact that they've got help. And I'm always very straightforward, for example, with the fact that, yeah, I own a house in Toronto. Why do I own a house in Toronto on a journalist's wage? Because I was lucky in terms of timing. I happened to buy a house like relatively early on. And like I said, I dodged a couple of massive home price increases. And I also had tremendous help from family. So that would be my guideline.
No, Eric, I really thank you. And as you were describing that, I know some people around the computer screen and who are going to be watching it later on probably practice in areas where these kinds of conversations come up, not having spoken through them. Challenges come up after the fact that some of the group might have to deal with. And I really liked in the book the example you have of that one woman who, she didn't have that kind of help from parents, but as a young mother, if I'm not mistaken, I think a single mom, she has indicated, she is doing what she can to ensure that she is able to support and help her daughter in a way as she moves forward. So there, at different stages, from the very beginning, when we make choices based on finances in our careers, when we are impacted from the debt that we take on, the lifestyle that we take on, when we think about investing for things that we want down the road, or saving for things that we want down the road, whether that's a partnership, whether it's a home, whether it is a travel budget, or whatever the case might be. I think these are really important things to be reviewing annually, or maybe more frequently, to have conversations with as we move forward. We've got a few more minutes, and I know there's still a couple of questions that you and I can talk about, but let me just open it up for a second to anybody else who has questions. And I saw in the chat, my biggest hang up or fear was always investing, and you talked about that. I see another person has said investing, others have said housing, but general questions that you might have for Erica about personal finance, or broadly finance and careers, or general comments. Let me just pause for a second. Remember, you can either put your hand up in the reactions button, or just unmute and join in the conversation. As people are thinking. Great. Erica, I want to ask you one question that you talked about when we were having the conversation, but one of them is about negotiating pay. And we had this conversation last month with Dilly from, but I wonder, what are your points as we think about, increasing our salaries, or helping future salaries for that matter, negotiating your pay? What's your thought on negotiating pay?
So it's super important. Again, like a lot of personal finance tends to focus so much on the spending and investing part of it, and almost like it feels like what you earn, like how to make money, is not part of personal finance. But that's a big mistake. It's huge. It's a game changer, right? Like the salary, the wage that they're gonna bring home. So it's very, very important to to negotiate and to know how to negotiate. And of course, negotiating gets easier as you advance in your career. But how do you do it? So the first step is to gather intelligence, right? Like, so you want to understand sort of what is a good compensation for the role I'm applying for. And so, yeah, for sure, you can, depending what sector you're in. For journalism, the stuff has always been completely useless, but there you can look at websites and Glassdoor and that stuff, but the more valuable intelligence and sort of like the on the ground intelligence that you're going to be able to gather yourself. And so it really pays to talk to, like, if you're at the very beginning, talk to alumni, talk to your peers who are maybe a little bit ahead of you and have, have similar roles to the ones you're applying to right now, or have had that role recently, right? And you want to try to have a conversation with them, and you don't want to be like, unless you're very close, like super upfront about like how much money are you making. But try to, a career counselor I like very much, who I interview in the book, Alison Venditti, calls it playing the over-under game. So start with a figure. And it's like, I was thinking about this for that role. Do you think that's reasonable? Or are you making more or less than X amount? And people are very awkward and sometimes reasonably so about telling you exactly how much they take home, but they will tell you if they make more or less than a certain amount, or if a certain amount that you have in mind is low or high. And so you can kind of like narrow your target. You can slowly zero in on your target with those conversations. As you advance in your career, then you're going to have a network of current and former colleagues, mentors, and such, who will have had or managed the position, a similar position to the one you're applying to. And that's like really great intelligence. So you want to go in like really informed. And then based on that sort of intelligence gathering that you've done, you want to come up with sort of a target that you're going to ask for. So it's good to know sort of what's my dream compensation, and what is something that I'd be okay with, and what is something that is too low and I'm really ready to walk away and look somewhere else, right? So you want to have sort of a high anchor, I call it, a sort of kind of a target, and a reserve value, right? And if you can, employers often will make an offer first. And that's because that gives them an advantage in negotiations. Any kind of negotiations, whatever offer comes up first is the one that they say that anchors the conversation. And they always try to anchor low. And so what you want to do is answer with your own anchor that kind of shifts the focus high. And you cannot answer with the value that you're like, I'd be fine settling for this. You want to go higher. No, a lot of people really worry about like, oh my God, what if I go so high that it's unreasonable? But you've done your research, you're not going to do that. But honestly, 10,000, 15,000, depending on your industry, even 30,000 more than sort of the target that you're like, I'm hoping to get this, like go quite a bit higher, because your employer was very likely going quite a bit lower than what they're willing to pay. And so if you go with what you are actually hoping for, you're very likely not going to get it, right? And then if you aim high, then you have this like wide sort of space in which you can negotiate. And don't forget that it's not just about your paycheck, right? There's all kinds of aspects of compensation, especially when you are starting out your very first job. You may not be able to negotiate that much on your pay, but You may be able to negotiate on the flexibility of your schedule, working from home, vacation, benefits, and when they start. Like I didn't know this, but reporting the book, I found out that you can even sort of negotiate to waive that 3-month waiting period that so many companies have before you can actually start tapping your health benefits. You can negotiate on pension, all kinds of things. Really, it's not just pay.
It's interesting. I just saw as you're having the conversation on the negotiating, I asked the question of whether or not people have had the chat with a mentor or colleague about what the range is, right? And in one instance, somebody has said yes, and the other, and I love it, hell no, much to the detriment of all involved. People are afraid or don't realize that they can or should have this conversation. And as you said, to have the negotiating conversation, you need to have your data. If you don't have data publicly available, which most of us don't have, you actually have to have that conversation. So again, with careers, being able to have mentors or colleagues that you can have these conversations with is really important, I think. So I appreciate you spending time in the book to discuss that, and also with the group now. We're going to wrap up soon, but let me just open it up. And I'm going to ask you sort of for final thoughts. Anybody have any other comments? Or there's a lot, and depending on the stage that you're at and your circumstances, I think there's a lot to take in. It's never too late, I think. There's always that possibility, and that there's always that time. And my comment to everybody often is, keep an open mindset, keep a learner's perspective on everything, including personal finances. And the fact that you said earlier on, Erica, you don't like math, you didn't know math. There's always this assumption that to do personal finances right, you have to be a math wizard. I really am grateful to you for telling us you don't need to have math as part of that background. So I really do appreciate that. Any final comments from the group or thoughts from the group? And I really am grateful for the engagement on the chat, at least. Okay. So Erica, I'm just going to make this comment. You end the book by saying, building a better post-pandemic economy will require bold ideas, fierce debate, and probably a good dose of trial and error. It's totally worth it. Post-pandemic, you wrote this during the pandemic. Tell us a little bit in terms of any final thoughts where we can be bold, have fierce debates, and be ready for some trial and error. Final thoughts, over to you.
Yeah, oh boy. Well, and that's kind of like where I end. Oh, sorry. I thought you were gone for a second there. So that's where I end the book on sort of, is it right to accept sort of financial help from your family? And the argument that I make is, as an individual making financial decisions, again, like, take that help if your family can afford it, and if it doesn't come with onerous conditions. But if you're worried about income inequality and all these larger issues, it's not in personal finance that you can make a difference in the financial decisions. It's really as a citizen, being informed and sort of and making decisions as a citizen of democracy. That's really where it matters, and where you should be making a difference. So housing for me right now is the top issue for personal finances. And I don't think we've made a lot of inroads there. And I wish it was higher up in the hierarchy of priorities. I would say for various levels of government. Yeah, but we have made some tremendous progress even since I wrote the book. You know, the childcare reform with all its shortcomings and implementation hiccups is starting to make a big difference for some of the families that I speak to, even some of my friends, right? Like it didn't. For me, I kind of like missed that boat because my kid is is 7 at this point, and we paid for childcare. But childcare was until recently sort of the size of a second mortgage payment. And now that's starting to not be the case any longer, which is tremendous. But there's a lot more. I'm talking about um, investing. One of the interesting trends that we're looking at that is very, very interesting, and kind of maybe something to feel optimistic about is so investing, as so many of you mentioned, is daunting for so many people, right? And now we're starting to see more private employers starting to offer defined benefit pensions, which means like that's the old-fashioned pension in which you are guaranteed a certain level of benefits, certain level of payout once you are retired, based on, you know, how many years you've worked and your rank, which is something that kind of like at one point almost disappeared from the private sector and was something that you can only get in the public sector. Now we're seeing a bit of a comeback, with many private employers kind of like pooling their funds to create this defined benefit pensions. It's something that I'm hoping to write about for the Globe at some point. So that's an excellent example of financial innovation really working for people. So that there's some reasons to feel very frustrated, I think, right now, about the larger issues that affect your personal finances. But there are also some reasons to feel like things, in some areas, things seem to be moving in the right direction. And if I have a minute, because everybody was saying, so we got so many comments about people, like particularly investing seemed to be a hot topic. So I talked a little bit about how to manage risk, but I also wanted to say that once you've sort of learned the basic concepts behind how to invest for retirement and invest for the long term in the financial markets, it's actually quite easy to invest. And in the book, I talk about 3 super easy, like low effort, low cost ways to invest well, which are and these are not in order of, like, I would say, robo-advisors. So think, this is not recommendations, but just so we know what you're talking about. So maybe Simple, a lot of some of the banks now do it. Questrade now has also a robo-advisor, and that's really sort of you basically it's like having a financial advisor that's like doesn't tweak with your portfolio all the time. And you just invest in these investments that are called ETFs, which are basically big pools of stocks, and sometimes stocks and bonds. And so robo-advisors are like financial advisors that can keep their costs very low, because they don't meet with clients face to face all the time. They build in economies of scale, and they don't build sort of personalized portfolios just for you. They just have some pre-made portfolios that are based on these ETFs, which have very low fees themselves. And so you just sort of go to a robo-advisor, you answer a simple questionnaire about your priorities, your risk tolerance, what are you investing the money for, and then they put you in sort of a pre-made portfolio that is generally well diversified and matches your risk profile. Another way is, and it's very similar, is an index mutual fund. Tangerine offers these. They have slightly higher fees, but an index mutual fund is basically very similar to an ETF. It's just a big pool of a bunch of stocks and bonds. And then you can sort of do the same thing, sort of a DIY. And this is a relatively recent type of investment, which is called an asset allocation ETF. And this is kind of like a big basket. It's an ETF that's a collection of ETFs almost. And you can buy sort of a single, it's like buying a single stock that is really sort of reflects just a very big collections of stocks and bonds spread out across industries, across countries. And it's really nice because you can just keep buying the same thing, and all you have to worry about is buying it again every month. And there's some tiny technical, like you may not be able to use all your money if you use a DIY approach. Like you may be left with, if you have $1,000, you may have like $7 left at the end of the month, and then some kind of sits there until you can invest in the next time. But it's super easy. Like there are really three easy. The easiest, I would say, the most hand-holding is the robo-advisor. So you can start from there if you feel like you're an absolute beginner, but and then you can maybe graduate to asset allocation ETFs, and it just makes it so easy to invest your money.
I love the suggestions, and it's that encouragement to learn and not be afraid, and take some understanding and some ownership. We've got Erica's contact information there. Looking forward to your career journey to see some additional information that you can provide to others through the Globe and Mail and through your book and other areas as we move forward. So thank you to everybody for joining. Just a reminder, we have next month, May 23rd, Anita Velikas will be joining us for her book, Unfolding My Wild and Precious Life. So looking forward to that as well. Erica, and to everybody, thank you so very much for the conversation today and for the book. Wishing everybody a great afternoon or evening, and good personal financial success as well. Erica, thanks everyone. Take care now.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Bye.